Continue. So welcome everybody to our fourth event of the term, Cambridge University Students Against Pseudoscience. Together with the Science Society of Cambridge, we are delighted to welcome Professor Stephan Lewandowsky, Professor Van der Linden, and Dr. Jon Roozenbeek to our humble society for this talk. And without any further ado, I'll pass over to Dr. Van der Linden. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction and invite. I'm really excited that we have this society at the university, Students Against Pseudoscience. I think this is really cool. So I'm glad we're doing the event. I won't talk a lot about me. For those who don't know me, I'm Sander. I'm a reader, associate professor in social psychology at in the Department of Psychology here at the University of Cambridge, and I direct the Cambridge Social Decision Making Lab. And we do research on influence and misinformation, among other things. But I'm really excited to introduce our speaker now, Professor Stephan Lewandowsky, whom we do a lot of research with, but Steve is also one of the world-leading researchers on the topic of misinformation. So we're really lucky to have him join us today. He has a long career of probably being, one of the most renowned memory researchers on the cognitive modeling and simulations of human memory, and by extension, how people retrieve information that is both true and false. And over time, I think that's developed into an interest in misinformation and anti-science attitudes, and how people think about science, why they deny science, how we could help design interventions to try to protect people from fake news. In fact, I think Steve's going to talk about some work that we're doing together with Google and other social media companies. So that's quite exciting. He has a long history of lots of accolades. The Wolfson Award, I think, from the Royal Society when he made the glamorous move to the United Kingdom. As a fellow of the Academy of Social Science, Association of Psychological Science, I think his research has been cited over 18,000 times. If you don't know how to contextualize that number, that's quite big in science. And then Jon Roozenbeek is also on the panel, our own Google Jigsaw postdoctoral fellow for the moment in the Department of Psychology, which will be followed by another prestigious fellowship. Jon is the co-brain, co-designer, co-inventor of all of the bad news, fake news, games, interventions, and many papers associated with that. The winner of the Frank Prize in Public Interest Communications for all his work in this area. So very happy Jon was able to join us here today as well. So without further ado, Steve, over to you.
Okay, thank you. And I believe you can still hear me and you can see my slides as far as I can tell. Okay, great. So, wow, I look forward to the discussion, the panel discussion, and then the Q&A after my talk. So I'm keeping my remarks relatively brief. And just to set the stage, you've probably all seen statistics such as this one about one individual, a barricaded individual in the White House, who is producing misinformation or false or misleading claims at an increasingly high rate. And losing the election has not stopped that trend. So we live in a world in which misinformation is sort of all over the place, and everybody is talking about it, and everybody is concerned about it. So, but why? Well, obviously, misinforming people is not a nice thing, so we would all be concerned about it anyway. But I think there's another angle to misinformation that members of the public perhaps don't always recognize. And that is that misinformation sticks. What I mean by that is when people are exposed to a false claim, such as this one from the last, the previous presidential election in the United States, when people are exposed to that claim, even if they're then also exposed to a subsequent correction, and even if they believe that correction, there is a massive amount of evidence suggesting that people still rely on the misinformation. And that is called the continued influence effect. And It occurs because as people are listening to information and as they're forming a mental model of the world, they're forming this coherent picture. And if I then tell you that a crucial part of that coherent picture is wrong, well, it's extremely difficult to kind of just yank that out and then run around the world with this hole in your mental model in the head. And so what then happens is that we observe something peculiar, which is that if you ask people explicitly what they believe to be true, they often tell us, oh, wow, you told me that was a myth. I now know it's false. I'm therefore not believing it, which sounds great, except the next moment they then act nonetheless as if they still rely on the misinformation. So misinformation sticks. Here is one example that is massively big in terms of numbers, and that is the belief in the existence of so-called weapons of mass destruction in Iraq prior to the invasion of 2003. Now, some of you may remember that that was the motivation, the alleged motivation for the invasion of Iraq by the US, the UK, and other countries. And then it turns out that there weren't any such weapons, that they never existed, or at least they didn't exist in the lead up to the invasion. Now, that's politics. What psychology is shown here in these data, which is that as recently as 2014, so that is more than 10 years, after the absence of weapons of mass destruction became official bipartisan American policy, 10 years after that, about half of Republicans and a third of Democrats believed that weapons of mass destruction had been found in Iraq. So this is one clear example of where corrections of misinformation or information that turned out to have been false had little or no effect. And by the way, this has consequences, political consequences, because the belief in weapons of mass destruction correlates with, or correlated back then with, support for the war and other political issues. So it's a non-trivial matter. And in fact, recent evidence in the context of the COVID pandemic suggests that misinformation has a causal effect on people's behavior. Now, causality is always difficult to establish, and some of the studies that have done this have used some very clever statistical techniques known as instrumental variables to isolate causal effects of misinformation. And that causal effect has been identified with ethnic hate crimes. There's a study from Germany which showed that the more people are exposed to Facebook, the more likely they are to indulge or commit ethnic hate crimes against refugees. And in fact, there's a metric arising from that research, which basically means that if you take out Facebook for a week, then, you know, 1 or 2 fewer refugees are being attacked. So these are very measurable effects. In the context of COVID, there were 2 papers published earlier this year linking Fox News causally to people's behavior with respect to social distancing and other measures to deal with the COVID pandemic. And in fact, statistically, you can enumerate how many people have died because of their consumption of a particular news show as opposed to other information. So I think misinformation matters. We're not talking about some sort of curiosity that's of interest to social scientists. No, I think this goes right to the heart of democracy. And for those of you who are really interested in this issue, here is a short link, sks.to/techdem, to a recent report written for the European Commission that I was lead author on, which reviews all these issues in great detail, including the causality issue that I've just mentioned. So that's the problem. That's what we have to deal with. How can we deal with that? Well, there are a number of ways in which we can deal with this, and the link that is on the screen behind me is to a recent compendium of recommendations for debunking, which, by the way, Jon and Sander both are also co-authors on. Now, what I want to do here in my talk is just focus on two related ways in which misinformation can be managed. One is that what matters a great deal is people's skepticism or suspicions of information that is being presented to them. So going back to the weapons of mass destruction and the Iraq War, I wrote a paper on this some time ago. In fact, that was my first exposure and my first foray into the arena of misinformation back then, where we showed that people who did not believe that weapons of mass destruction were the true motive for the invasion of Iraq were far better at differentiating truths from falsehoods, and they were less likely to mistakenly believe that WMD, weapons of mass destruction, had been discovered after the invasion. And there's other data from mock jury decision-making research where similarly, if you make a jury suspicious of the reason why tainted evidence was introduced, they're then able to discard or disregard that evidence when coming to a decision. So that's one way in which you can keep information from sticking, or in which you can correct it and unstick it afterwards. The other approach, which is conceptually, I think, closely related, is to inoculate people against misinformation. And this is what I want to talk about for the remainder of today. And this is something that Jon and Sander have worked on a lot and have made a very significant contribution to. Now, inoculation has two elements. The first element is to warn people that they might be misled. And the second component is to refute an anticipated argument that exposes the imminent fallacy. Now, the good thing about inoculation is that it does not require advanced knowledge of what exactly people will hear when they're being misinformed, although it does require advanced knowledge of how people might be misinformed. And so let me tell you what I mean by that by walking you through one experiment that Sander and Jon and I have recently done. This is the study that was funded by Google, as Sander has already mentioned, where the basic idea is that in the critical condition of interest, we show people brief videos about how they might be misled. In the control condition, of course, we show them another video that's completely irrelevant. And then afterwards, after this inoculation treatment, we're presenting them with, tweets or social media messages that they then have to assess. And they have to tell us whether or not they find them believable, whether they would share them, et cetera, et cetera. So let me walk you through our first experiment that tested this out. We have now done at least one more with similar results, although using a different video. And what we do is we take a representative sample, a very large sample, about 1,000 people in our case, to make sure we have sufficient statistical power. We then take that representative sample and split it into two groups, one that gets inoculated and another one that gets an unrelated video. Then we test people's responses to social media messages. Now, to understand the data that I'll be presenting in a minute, it's crucial to understand that what we're looking at here is discernment. What I mean by that is we're looking at the ability of people to tell manipulative social media posts from non-manipulative, neutral social media posts. So what we're interested in is to enhance that discernment or discrimination between good and bad information in our participants. And let me show you one video from our first experiment, which deals with emotional manipulation. So here you go. You're now actually in the experimental condition in our experiment.
You might think about skipping this ad. Don't. What happens next will make you tear up. Wait, you're still here? I mean, great. Looks like the trick works. You see, when watching videos or browsing online, you're likely to encounter content that is loaded with emotional language. And with good reason. Playing into emotions, especially negative ones such as fear, anger, or contempt, is a trick to get you to pay attention to something when you otherwise wouldn't. It's likely that is a big part of the reason you're still watching this ad is because you were lured in by our use of emotional language in the very first sentence. Research has shown that expressing emotion is key for the spread of moral and especially political ideas in social networks. So let's say when you're writing a headline and you're trying your hardest to manipulate your readers to click. One thing you can do is pepper your headlines with a bunch of emotionally charged words. Call it a horrific accident instead of a serious one, a disgusting ruling instead of a disagreeable one, or a heartbreaking twist of fate instead of an unfortunate coincidence. That way, you're likely to reach more people and influence their reactions. So let's see how this plays out in real life. Let's take the following headline from the movie Angry. No emotional manipulation at play here. Just to the point, no nonsense coverage of such an important event in world history. This headline, on the other hand, see what they did there? The writer used an emotionally charged word like revolting to describe a whole group of people. I mean, these people. Oh well, you get the point. They're fear-mongering. So whenever you feel outraged or angry, remember, someone may be pulling your strings. Don't be manipulated. Truth Labs, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
So there you go. We're the Truth Labs. That's our brand name for this series of experiments. And that was the inoculation treatment. That was just under 2 minutes, that video. And immediately afterwards, participants in our experiment would be presented with test items, some of which were manipulative, others weren't. You can guess which one this is. This is a pseudo tweet that we created that starts out, beware, an 8-year-old girl was abducted yesterday at Disney World, and then it goes on, and thank God they found her 9 minutes later, but she had a shaved head already. So, well, I would argue that's probably a manipulative post. And we asked our participants the questions about that manipulativeness, their confidence in assessing the manipulativeness. They rated the trustworthiness of the posts and whether or not they would share this post with their network of friends. So what do the data show? Well, we're now looking at discernment. Remember now, those are the difference scores or the difference in people's ability to tell apart the neutral statements, the neutral social media posts from the manipulative ones. The greater that number, the more or the better able people are to differentiate between good and bad content. And what I'm showing you here are the raw data presented in violin plots with the means drawn in, the solid lines. And just to visualize the direction of the effect, I'm putting in a red line here, which shows that in the inoculation group, that is the one that saw the video you just saw, people were better able to discern manipulativeness than the people in the control condition, which viewed some other video, I think about freezer burn or something, completely unrelated and uninformative. So that's manipulativeness. You get the same result with trustworthiness. The effect is visually quite small, but it is statistically highly significant. After the inoculation treatment, people's ability to discern trustworthiness increases. And finally, we get the same effect for sharing. That is, people are more able to differentiate good content that they might share from poor content that they're less likely to share. So again, the discernment, the ability to tell good from bad has increased after inoculation compared to the control condition. Now, one interesting aspect about these data, by the way, is that there's, out of 1,000 people or so, there's hundreds and hundreds who say they never share anything. Well, that's okay. They're not the people we're concerned with. We're concerned with people who share information and who are not very good at discerning what they should be sharing. Well, we show here that our very brief manipulation of 2 minutes has a small but highly significant effect. Now, just a note on the size of the effect. Small effect, some people say, oh, well, what's the point of having a small effect? Well, the point of having a small effect is that if you scale it up to 1 billion people or whatever on Facebook, then a small effect makes a big difference at scale. The last 2 elections in the United States were decided by margins that were actually extremely small. Even the last one in the critical states, adding it all up, the margin wasn't that great. And so if you can reduce the sharing of misinformation by a small amount, it scales up at a society level to being quite significant, I would argue. So what's the current state of this whole approach of inoculation? Well, there have now been a number of demonstrations of inoculation against misinformation. It's been shown in a number of contexts, including potentially radicalizing extremist material. Jon and Sander have a paper on that coming out, and one of my students and I also have a paper in the pipeline on that, and we show converging evidence that this even works with radicalizing material. And it works against other rhetorical disinformation techniques. Now, that's okay. That's great. But that leaves open another problem, which is what I want to talk about next. And that is targeted manipulation. Now we have to talk about Facebook. What you may or may not know is that if anybody has access to 300 likes on Facebook, then your personality can be identified with greater accuracy than your own spouse will know you. Here are the data from a study from 5 years ago where they showed that. It's a sort of a complicated graph, but the bottom line is that if you look at the number of Facebook likes required to beat your spouse, well, then you need about 300. But to beat other family members, you just need about 90 or 100. And to beat work colleagues, 10 likes are enough. In other words, the artificial intelligence that you can train up using Facebook likes is sufficient to infer a person's personality with considerable precision. Now, this isn't just some sort of, research finding. It actually goes straight to the business model of Facebook. Here's a patent that they filed in 2014, where they actually say, oh, we have this algorithm that infers personality characteristics, which we will use for targeting, ranking, selecting versions of products, and various other purposes. So Facebook is very open about it. This is a public document. They say, hey, we're doing this. We're targeting you. Does this micro-targeting, does sending messages to individuals based on their vulnerability, does that work? Does it have an effect? Well, the answer appears to be yes. There's at least one study that designed ads to appeal to extroverts or introverts, how outgoing people are. This is a common personality dimension. And just to show you what this is about, on the left, guess what? This is an ad that targets extroverts, people who are outgoing. The ad on the right is targeting people who are introverts, who are less inclined to be out there at noisy parties. And that difference between ads translates into actual purchases on Facebook. Here are the data. This is now the conversion rate. That is the number of people who look at an ad and then click through to purchase something. And what you find basically is that the color matched ads, in other words, blue means extroverted, so a blue extroverted ad with an extroverted audience, or a green introverted ad with an introverted audience, whenever they match, they sell more than if they're mismatched. So a fairly reliable, measurable effect of the effectiveness of targeting. Now, in that study I just showed you, that was cosmetic ads. Maybe we shouldn't be terribly concerned about, cosmetics. Why do we care if that is micro-targeted? But the problem is that it isn't just cosmetic ads that are being targeted on Facebook. What we now know was that 2 years ago it became apparent that Cambridge Analytica harvested millions of users' data and used that to target political messages during the Brexit referendum and the 2016 American presidential election. Now, we don't know exactly how much an effect that had, although there are people who used to work for Facebook who, after the scandal broke about a year ago now, were very outspoken about how this is undermining democracy. And if you think about it for a moment, then I think it's quite obvious that micro-targeted messages are problematic in a democracy for political messages. Why? Well, because no one sees an ad except the person who's targeted or the people who are sending the message. No one else knows that this message exists. Now, that is antithetical to this idea of democracy as a free marketplace of ideas where people argue it out in public and the public is then clever enough to discover what's true and what is false, or what works for them, what doesn't. Well, that disappears if you go from a public debate to secret manipulation, where people are targeted based on their personality and their specific vulnerabilities, because no rebuttal is possible if you don't know that. Now, the UK Parliament did an inquiry on this issue, and they decided that Facebook, they called them literally in the report, a digital gangster, a law-breaking digital gangster. That's not typically the language of parliamentary inquiries, and yet they used that. And this is widely recognized among the public. Here's a global survey done by Ipsos last year, where 75% of people in various different countries around the globe cited social media companies as being responsible for why they distrust the internet. So we have a problem out there with micro-targeted political manipulation using social media. And no matter what Facebook may say, they haven't solved that problem. I can go into the details later if you want. It's also outlined in great depth in the report that I think one of the links was circulated in the chat. So what do we do other than political measures such as regulations, antitrust lawsuits, and all that kind of thing? Well, a number of colleagues and I, we tried to reverse engineer micro-targeting by saying, oh, okay, for now, we have to accept that Facebook is doing this. We don't have much of a recourse to that at the moment. So what if we could train people to recognize that they are the target of manipulation? So the last experiment I want to talk to you about briefly is this one where we assign people at random into two groups. In one condition, they were given a personality scale to assess their position on the extroversion-introversion scale. In the other control condition, they were given some irrelevant questionnaire that looked very similar, though. They were given feedback on their score. In the experimental condition on the left, that was a relevant score, namely their extroversion-introversion score. They then, in both conditions, were presented with ads. And all people had to do was to classify those ads as being targeted at them to manipulate them versus not targeted. That's all people had to do. So to explain this a bit more, what we would tell people in the experimental condition is something about extroverts and introverts. In the actual experiment, it was a lot more text than what I'm showing you here. But basically, extroverts are kind of outgoing, engaged with the external world. Introverts are kind of, more private. We then gave people true, correct, personalized feedback based on their scores. So, for example, here's a person who scored relatively high on the extroversion scale. They would be shown this graph saying that they're more extroverted than 74 out of 100 people of their age. Here's another example of an extreme introvert. They would be shown the same graph, but of course with the numbers different. So they received correct feedback about their own personality in the experimental condition. And then this was the task. Is this ad targeted at you? And people had to answer yes or no. And what we were interested in is whether the feedback about their personality would increase their correct classification. So the correct answer here is yes, if you are an extrovert. The correct answer would be no if you're an introvert. So here are the data. And the data are quite stunning, really, for me as a social scientist. That's one of the largest effect sizes I've seen in a long time, where after personality feedback, people on average score about 90% correct. In the control condition, without that feedback, they only score at about 60%. That happens to be above chance, significantly so. So people can do this without the training, but we boost their capability by about 30 percentage points in accuracy by giving them feedback about their personality, which, as far as effect sizes and social science goes, is huge. So we can conclude, and we have like 3 experiments that did this, so with varying different permutations of the manipulation, and there's, in my mind, no question that this replicates and that it's a robust, large effect. We can conclude that people can at least detect advertisements that are directed at them based on their personality. Now, what we don't know yet is whether that can translate into resilience. We don't know yet if detecting targeting is sufficient for people to say, oh, okay, never mind, I'm not going to buy that lipstick because they're trying to manipulate me. And those were the points I was trying to make. And here, just to leave you with another link to the most recent debunking handbook that was authored by more than 20 people, including among them Sander and Jon, with me as lead author, that summarizes the current knowledge about the science of debunking. And with that, I'll leave it at that. I look forward to the discussion and your questions.
Thank you very much for that. I'll pass over to everyone now for the panel discussion, and then after that, I'll pass over to Krishna. Will take over and lead the Q&A from the Science Society. But I'll pass over to you for the panel discussion now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Steve, for this fascinating talk. And maybe we could, I know time's limited. Maybe we could kind of mix it with the audience so people can, insert their comments and ask questions. I guess just a high level kind of takeaway is one that, you know, people are continue to be influenced by misinformation even when it's been corrected. So that makes corrections after the fact very difficult. And hence other methods can be useful, like pre-bunking or inoculation, where you preemptively inoculate people against falsehoods when that's possible. But that becomes quite tricky when people are being micro-targeted and they may not know that they're being targeted. So it's really positive to see these results, that you can boost people's resilience to micro-targeting attempts by improving their knowledge of some of the traits that are being targeted. I guess, Steve, maybe we'll kick off with a question, a larger sort of question. I'm not a huge fan. I don't know if everyone's seen The Social Dilemma on Netflix. I wasn't a huge fan of that documentary, but there was some interesting stuff in there. And one of, John might have some thoughts on this too. One of my favorite sentences in that whole documentary was that people tend to forget that if you're not paying for a service, you know, if you're using the product without paying for it, then you are the product.
Exactly.
And yes. Yeah, so Facebook is driving engagement off of our behaviors, and that's why people are being targeted for their engagement. So Steve, how could social media companies learn from the stuff that you've been doing? What do they need to do in order to change their practices?
Well, I mean, yes, that's the elephant in the room, isn't it? And that is extremely important to know and to underscore, that much of what happens online is driven by the attention economy, where the only thing that matters is user engagement with the platform. So they can sell your attention to their advertisers, and they will do anything to make that happen. When I say they'll do anything, what I mean by that is that we now know that Facebook was fully aware of the polarizing effect that their algorithm had on the American public, and they knew how to fix it, but they declined to do that because they were worried about losing some revenue. So, and YouTube has been accused of similar conduct by people who used to work there and who claim that they were fired because they wanted to change that. Now, I'm inclined to believe that this could be true. Let's put it that way. I'm even more inclined to say that it would be miraculous if an algorithm that is designed to enhance user engagement and nothing else would coincidentally also guide people to high quality information. I mean, that would be miraculous if by maximizing attention, you all of a sudden educated people. And you know what? I don't believe in miracles. And I don't think that's what's happening. I think that attention maximizing algorithms probably have a perverse consequence of leading people to low quality content. So what do the social media platforms have to do about it? Well, they have to change their business model, don't they? Will they want to do that? No. Can you force them to do it in a democracy? Yes. So I think, frankly, what I think has to happen is that we have to regulate what social media companies can and can't do. Now, that's very challenging for some people who instantly think, oh my God, censorship, interference, government, my God. And I agree with those concerns. But anybody who says we shouldn't regulate the internet doesn't recognize that the internet as we have it right now is fully regulated by corporations for their own commercial interests. So it's not a matter of regulating the internet. It's a matter of making the regulation publicly and democratically accountable, as opposed to maximizing the profits of social media platforms. That's really the choice we're facing. So I think ultimately that's a conversation we have to have. And I'm personally convinced that over the next year or two, something along those lines will happen at the European level. We don't know what form that's going to take, and I hope they're going to do it right, because there are ways in which this can be done without censorship. by introducing friction, by introducing subtle, slight changes to the architecture, which are very effective. We have plenty of precedents for that. I don't know if any of you are on Twitter, but if you're on Twitter, if you now want to retweet something without having read it, it'll say, hey, do you really want to do this? Now, I think that's not censoring anybody, but it is slowing things down because it kind of provides a very strong nudge that you should maybe read what you're about to retweet. So that's just one example of many, many things.
That's great, Steve. I feel I agree. I'm not sure, John, Twitter has started pre-bunking on their own, inoculating people against myths about the 2020 election. They did that. What do you think, John? Is pre-bunking going to be enough for the social media platforms to inoculate everyone? Can we trust them to pre-bunk?
No, not really. I think like the experimental results that Steve just showed and some of the work that we've been doing that hasn't been presented here is experimentally very robust. We know basically that this works pretty much as we envision it working, and we can point to some really, really nice statistics that this is having positive effects on at least, self-reported behavioral intentions and, self-reported perceived manipulativeness or reliability of misinformation and so on. Great, really good. What I worry about a little bit is obviously we should be doing this kind of stuff, the stuff that's experimentally robust that we know works, we should be doing it, great. But if you are Twitter or Facebook, if you're able to point to a behavioral solution or inoculation or whatever as the thing that you're doing to combat the spread of misinformation, I am skeptical that that is truly enough to make a real difference, because exactly as Steve says, unfortunately, what is very likely to be the case is that truly effective solutions will drastically impact the business models of a lot of these companies. And that means that if a solution is really popular among the executives at Google, Facebook, and Twitter, it is most likely not going to be a very good solution on its own. So I think one of the conversations that will be very interesting to have is, okay, to what extent can we not ban social media or make them illegal or anything like that? Because that's not going to happen. It's completely absurd. But we don't ban alcohol and cigarettes either, even though we realize that they're clearly having a harmful effect, right? But even though we don't ban them, we do have rules for their consumption. For example, for children, we don't sell cigarettes or alcohol to children, right? So to what extent should we allow Facebook to micro-target under 18s, let's say? Or to what extent can we come up with a set of reasonable rules for Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or whatever for like the kind of content that is shown to kids? Something along those lines, which that has its own problems for sure, but it is a conversation that we are not really having yet. And I'm also pretty sure that it is a conversation that makes people like Mark Zuckerberg pretty uncomfortable. So if you ask me, that's a conversation that we therefore should be having.
Yeah, and I think people sometimes say, social media isn't the root cause of our problem. There's no causal evidence of social media making being the clear cause. But obviously, it has a huge negative effect even when people come onto social media with their own beliefs and misconceptions and things. That it provides a platform for people to perpetuate those and sometimes aggravate them. But Steve, I think the only point to keep in mind is that people keep talking about social media because the amount of anti-science and pseudoscience that you see comes from social media, not BBC News, for example. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah. I think with science, you can say. I mean, yes. I think with science, social media is certainly a source of a lot of pseudoscientific nonsense. And also on the causal issue, I mean, I mentioned that early on in my talk. I think there is now an increasing amount of evidence to point to a causal role of not just social media, but media in general. So now I'm not suggesting that is unequivocally resolved. It's probably not. But I'm now at the point where I think it would be really kind of strange for somebody to say, oh, no, this doesn't matter at all. I mean, come on. Seriously? You really think this doesn't matter? Of course it matters. And we have evidence to suggest it is a cause, not a consequence of other variables. So, yeah, and I agree with you. The BBC is really probably better than Twitter when it comes to science. When it comes to other issues, we got to be a little bit more careful, because I can think of issues where the BBC has done the public massive disservice over the last few years by...
Yeah, the 50-50, the climate denial.
Well, I'm not just talking about climate change. That's sort of easy because it's science. But when it gets to politics and, you know, and nationalistic emotions and all those things, then you know, I'm not a great supporter of BBC coverage on that, because I think it's been highly misleading generally. And that is a real problem that we're not going to solve by regulating Facebook. On the contrary, you can argue that social media do offer an escape out of mainstream media that have been hijacked by, you know, whatever, populists, nationalists, and so on. And that's why I'm very concerned about things like censorship. You know, I don't want to censor anything. I just want to have a meaningful landscape that facilitates high quality information, as we know how to do it. I mean, there is a whole literature out there on deliberative platforms, deliberative forms of democracy that can be conducted online. In Taiwan, they use a platform called Taiwan that they use for political decision making, you know, and it's citizens get involved and they're talking to each other on this platform, and it's not spiraling out of control because there are various architectural tweaks that are put in place to avoid that. You know, people are totally capable of having a civilized discussion. I mean, and even now, even with Twitter, you know, people are capable of doing that. It's just they don't do it because the inducements of the architecture are counterproductive. And if you change that to make it more productive, to have sensible deliberation, then people are going to do it. We know that. So the key is to design, is to have a better landscape.
And if I may add one small thing. Oh.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly as Steve mentioned, I think it's really important to keep in mind that mainstream does not equal good, and non-mainstream or like individual content creators does not equal bad or malicious, right? There are a million really, really good content creators on YouTube, for example, who do news shows that are great. And even when it comes to things like some conspiracy theories, I don't mind if Joe Rogan speculates about the moon landing on his YouTube channel, right? That might be a conspiracy and it might be complete nonsense. And you could argue that there is a gateway effect towards more harmful conspiracies, and that's all fair enough. But in itself, you know, someone smoking weed on YouTube and just basically bullshitting about the moon landing isn't necessarily something that I think should be regulated out of existence, because that's the kind of thing that would happen anyway.
I but I'm a little more cautious about conspiracy theories because earlier this year, something like 80 cell phone towers were
yes, exactly.
in the UK because of this utterly nonsensical idea that 5G had something to do with COVID. You know, it's just crazy talk. It's just, it's ridiculous, and it creates a public health hazard. And there's data to suggest that it actually leads to, or that the people who endorse that kind of conspiracy theory also endorse violence as a means to deal with social problems, and in particular in the 5G context. And I'm not sure that that's the kind of information we can afford to have out there. I mean, you know, so we have to be careful about that, and it's very tricky. It's
a slippery definition for sure. Yeah. Let me pivot to the Q&A for the students. Is that okay?
Right.
I know they're running out of time.
Oh yeah, I'm happy. Anybody? Yep. I just don't know how to do this.
There was one question about epistemic truth that really confused me.
One second.
One is more of a comment that I quite enjoyed about the micro-targeting experiment that says maybe the data says more about how much people know about their spouses. But you know, that it could be an alternative explanation. Luis, sorry, back to you.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I'm just going to say thank you for a very engaging discussion. I'm just going to hand over to before we do the Q&A briefly. I'm going to hand over to Krishna from Science Society to talk a bit about themselves, because without them we couldn't have had this event. So Krishna, if you'll just take over, and they'll be running the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Luis. So thank you very much to Stephan for the talk, and to the other two for that interesting discussion just there. Yeah. So as Luis mentioned, I'm Krishna, and I run the Science Society, who's co-organizing this. So yeah, I mean, just to, I guess, go through some of the questions. I don't know if you guys had any particular ones from the chat, at least, that you wanted to kick off with that you found particularly interesting.
Well, I'd love to hear Steve's view on his epistemological position on truth.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah,
coherence theory or correspondence theory. Yeah, very good. Well, it's very interesting because Sander, John, and I just ran an experiment involving incoherence. And the reason it did that is, well, twofold. Number one, because a lot of conspiratorial argumentation is incoherent. You know, we know that. And if you've listened to Karen Douglas, she may have mentioned that. She's done the work on that in part. And climate denial, for example, is entirely incoherent, right? Because they'll tell you on a Monday that you can't measure global temperature because thermometers don't work. And then on Tuesday, they tell you, oh, don't worry about global warming because it's been cooling for 18 years. Well, how do you know that if thermometers don't work, right? Makes no sense. So incoherence is a hallmark, basically, of people being wrong, you know. So minimally, I think to have any chance of being right, you have to be coherent. So I personally use coherence and incoherence as markers of bad information, you know. Now, that doesn't mean that anything that's coherent is necessarily true. So there's got to be more to it than just coherence. But certainly I can flip it around and I can say anybody who's incoherent can't be right. I mean, at least half of what they're saying is wrong, you know. And so in that sense, for the purposes of what we're talking about here, I think coherence theory is extremely important, because that's the thing that is usually quite easy to establish. And you also don't have to argue about the data. You know, if somebody is incoherent, they're incoherent. Doesn't matter what you know, doesn't matter what the thermometers say, because if they're saying one thing and then another that doesn't cohere, then why do we waste time on that? But of course, you know, you also got to talk about things that are you know, that correspond to real things in the world, like Donald Trump claiming his inauguration crowd was the largest ever in history. I mean, you know, again, we don't have to talk about that. That was just nonsense, complete.
Let's pivot, Steve. Something you and I talk about quite a bit as well, about the sort of the Nietzsche interpretation of, you know, there are no facts, only interpretations, postmodernist views. You can never know anything. You know, scientific method is reductionist. The individuals who are coincidentally also more likely to espouse pseudoscientific views. How do we deal with that kind of argument?
Well, it's a well, I just wrote a chapter about that, which you probably know, on you know, the different ontologies of truth that are out there. And one of the concerning things and one of the ugly little secrets of constructivism is that the fascist ontology of truth was entirely relativist and constructionist. You know, I mean, the Nazis and the Italian fascists explicitly rejected the idea of evidence as being relevant. What was relevant to them was not evidence, but it was, the deeper truth that was felt by the leader, who then translated that deeper, sort of intuition to the people who then had the truth. And concerningly, Donald Trump is on record for saying precisely the same things along those lines. So I think there is a problem with, an exaggerated sense of relativism and constructivism. I think that's inappropriate. Having said that, I'm also well aware of the fact that most knowledge, or scientific knowledge, is socially constructed, and that different people in different contexts can have different perceptions of what is going on. So it's not a, it's a bit of a conundrum, because you can't, I'm unable to sort of come down really hard on one side or the other. But what I do know is that just because some things are shades of gray, that doesn't mean black and white don't exist. And that, I think, is a good point. I think that's a good point. If Donald Trump is lying about the size of his inauguration crowd, let's not waste time debating that. Okay, that's just nonsense. There are other things where we have to talk, like, what's the unemployment rate? Is that measured in a fair and balanced way? Is inflation really what they say it is? Because it depends on how it is measured. There's stuff where we can have a political contestation of what constitutes a fact. But lying and making stuff up are a completely different category, and we have to have an ontology of truth that admits that distinction. And that's where I think some social scientists have failed to articulate that clearly. And they have.
I think that's what we're targeting here in terms of manipulation specifically, not any notion of what could be false. I realized there were a few pings on somebody who's asked a number of questions. Let's run through them. Maybe John, this would be a fun one for you. Would you be okay with Donald Trump designing regulations for social media platforms? And I'm sure Steve can weigh in as well. They elaborate then saying, well, the concern is that if you let governments regulate social media, who's judging the judges, John? Who is it?
Would I be okay with Donald Trump designing regulations to social media platforms? No, but I'm not okay with Joe Biden doing that either, right? This is not it should definitely be a very it's a political discussion for sure, but not one that I generally trust elected officials to handle extremely well. In the United States is obviously concerned with things like lobbying, right, and campaign donations and so on, which makes it very difficult for that process to occur in such a way that it really doesn't actually solves the problem, rather than becomes a watered down version of what we might be looking for. But in principle, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, for example, conservatives should not be or should be designing regulations for social media platforms. Sure, why not? As long as those regulations are, arrived at in a way that we can all agree is going to solve the problem in a meaningful way. I don't really care who does it. Right? That is not of importance to me at all. But obviously, we're going to disagree about what the desired endpoint is going to be. But that's just part of politics, and I'm kind of happy that I'm not a politician in that.
Yeah. If we accept some version of a government for and by the people, then who's regulating companies are people indirectly through the people they elect and trust to take care of that. Assuming that process works, of course, Steve.
Of course, and I mean, there are so many distortions in some ostensibly democratic countries, where parliaments get shut down illegally and they break international law. You can think of but a country somewhere that might do that. There are distortions that are very concerning. But I don't think we have much of a choice. I would much rather have an imperfect, democratically elected government try to regulate Facebook than Mark Zuckerberg, who is accountable to no one, right, other than his own motives, and they appear to be to maximize his profit, which is, of course, what corporations are supposed to do. So I'm concerned about it, but I'm equally concerned about the status quo. I think the solution is to set the frame for the discussion from the outset as not being about censorship. And this is that report I mentioned earlier goes into that in great detail, that aside from obvious things like hate speech and horrible violence and all that, where we already have laws in place. Aside from that, I don't like regulation of content, but I do like, regulation of reach. Freedom of speech does not mean freedom of reach. Not every idiot is entitled to an audience of 10 million people. I mean, why would we even think of a society where that would be appropriate? I mean, if you had to design a democratic society from scratch, do you really want to give everybody the same reach? I mean, it just creates noise. We've got to have a mechanism to differentiate between information of different quality. And in my opinion, that can be done by examining how the algorithms work, by introducing friction when people are sharing information that is identified to be of dubious quality. Doesn't mean they can't read it, doesn't mean they can't share it with their friends, but let's just make it a little harder, And the moment you make it harder, by a tiny amount, you lose half the shares. So you're cutting viral spread of nonsense at a very low cost. So I think there's a lot of things you can do that to improve the quality of discourse. I mean, yes. One other, I don't know, are you familiar with the WhatsApp murders in India? Do you know that story? Just briefly, a couple of years ago, there were like horrendous mob killings in India. Innocent people were being just killed by mobs, which were the result of false videos being circulated on WhatsApp, inciting people for no reason at all to kind of kill these people because allegedly they were kidnappers. Now, there's a lot more to it than that, but it turns out that what WhatsApp did in reply is two things. Number one, they limited the number of people you can forward a message to 5 from previously an infinite or virtually infinite number. And they identified each forwarded message as actually being forwarded, whereas previously a message that you forwarded to your friend would be seen as coming from you, from the friend's perspective. So they fixed that. And now, again, attributing causality, very difficult, but, those murders stopped. Because it was just harder to form mobs. Now, to me, that's not censorship. That is just designing an architecture that makes it harder for people to kill others. Why wouldn't you?
So let's tag on I'll quickly, the conversation here is quite funny. I'll ping back to Krishna when, if there's more questions or if we need to end. But the question, some would argue Trump's influence on the CDC is a point in case for why it's dangerous for elected politicians to regulate what science we should talk about. And then the other question was, what do you think the best way would be to disseminate anti-manipulation training, to which somebody responded by micro-targeting people. So, I think that the idea here is that it is dangerous for elected officials to regulate what science is convenient to them. But I think because of that point, Facebook is regulating what science is convenient for them. I mean, there's lots of science that points to how they could improve their platform, but they choose not to implement it.
Worse than that. Facebook actually has also, at least temporarily, taken down information by climate scientists because they said, oh, that's political, including people I know very well who are seriously good scientists.
And so one thing they could do was implement these approaches in a transparent way and tell people when they're being micro-targeted, boost people's knowledge about their online digital footprint, let people know how they're being targeted and why, and how they can help spot it. Facebook could easily do that. They could help people spot manipulative content, but they're not because nobody tells them that they need to, and obviously it's not in the interest of their platform. So I think the difference is that science isn't regulated by generally too much by politicians, neither by companies, and I think that's why we have lots of independent scientific bodies and organizations who can advise people. But when people use science for their own purposes, whether it's political or maximizing profit, I think that's where it becomes politicized. And of course, that's the whole sort of area that we're talking about here. Sorry, Steve, you were about to jump in.
Well, I mean, two things. First of all, not only could Facebook tell people when they're targeted, they could also make the targeting information available for every single ad they run. So if a politician wants to rebut a message, they have the chance of addressing the same audience. And at the moment, even though Facebook has an ad library out there, that doesn't contain that information. I cannot send an ad to the same people who saw a misleading ad about me if I'm a politician. So, for example, I mean, that's an easy thing. You can just mandate that. You know, that's a stroke of a pen and a law, and Facebook will have to comply. I mean, you know, it's not hard. It's not rocket science. And the other thing about the CDC and Trump, I think that's actually a very good example for the point I'm making, which is that you need regulation. And in other words, you need to have a governance structure for the CDC that makes it politically independent, and that it doesn't become you know, the president's playpen, whether that's Trump or Biden, I don't care. You got to have independence. And that's precisely, I think, what I'm talking about. You got to have good laws and regulations that are preserving independence in the case of the CDC, and that are making it harder to disseminate misinformation without censoring. That's the challenge. The intellectual challenge is to find the way of doing that. And in my opinion, there are hints in that direction. I mean, there are plenty of them. We can do that. We know how to do it.
There was an interesting media regulation basically present in the United States up until the 1980s when Reagan got rid of it, called the Fairness Doctrine, which is basically it said you're allowed to say whatever you want, but you have to represent political opinions fairly, as in you're not allowed to tell overt and clear lies about what your political opponents want or are doing. If you're discussing a policy, for example, let's say it's about abortion, you are not allowed to say Democrats want to kill every baby or whatever, because that's objectively incorrect, right? There's an interesting discussion to see whether that's really a good thing or not, but revisiting this idea of a fairness doctrine for the digital age for social media companies, exactly as Steve is saying, for example, political ads they can be targeted, but you have to have an opposing political ad targeted at the same people, for example, might be a good solution, or an idea we're thinking about at the very least. And if I may address Georgina's question about the best way to disseminate anti-manipulation trainings, I think, Sander, we might have to get rid of our underground lab where we do the whole Clockwork Orange thing and force people to watch our inoculation videos. I think that's kind of out of date, unfortunately. But
it's too bad.
Yeah, basically, like, if my opinion is, like, if you make anti-manipulation trainings good and fun and entertaining, people will enjoy them on their own. You don't need to force them. So that's what we did with the games that we made, for example. Like, they're played quite a lot because they're fun, or at least that's the impression I get from people, which are obviously biased because they're telling me, right? But still, right, so that's already a thing that we can do. I don't think we need to mandate that kind of thing, because there's a huge potential for that kind of thing to backfire too.
Well, but I agree. You don't have to mandate people, like re-education training, like put people in camps and watch the video, like Clockwork Orange or something. You don't have to do that, but you could mandate for YouTube to put one of our public service videos, like the one I showed earlier, to make that appear in the recommender tab 1 in 100 times for everybody who's using YouTube. So they're just recommending a public service message. I mean, what's wrong with that? That is not forcing people to watch the video. It's just sitting there, and it is given as an option. Hey, if you're interested in this, you might also be interested in not being manipulated. How about it? Check out this video. I don't see any problem with that. That's not infringing on anybody's freedom. It's not, you know, they can choose to ignore that video. So I don't see a problem with that.
I was just going to say that.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, I mean, millions of people play our intervention without any, any mandates or attracting or using social media companies. But if social media companies were to distribute it on their own initiative, we could reach millions of people, and it could be done in a very transparent way, and people can choose to ignore it or to engage with it. And then they'd be helping to, the reason why they're a bit hesitant to do that is because it might reduce engagement with their platform. And I should say openly that, you know, we work with Facebook and WhatsApp, and Steve and John and I work with Google. So we do work with these companies, and the research teams are great often. They try to do their best, but they often want to do something that does a little bit of good, but doesn't decrease engagement at the same time. And that nexus is quite difficult to operate within, because not the best solution isn't always the one that maximizes engagement with their platform. And so, you know, I think without any incentive on their side to implement science, it'll be difficult for them to change their ways in a way that is evidence-based. What incentive does Facebook have to counter pseudoscience on their platform if selling fake COVID cures increases engagement, generates revenue for Facebook? Why not? So I think the question we do have to ask ourselves is, at what point does society as a collective decide that something has to be done about that?
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
How are we doing on time, guys?
Well, I think the natural flow of questions at the chat seem to have slowed down a bit. So I think, I mean, thanks so much for just discussing those questions. It's a great kind of natural extension of the panel discussion. I think I'll hand over back to Luis, who probably has some things to say. But at least
Well, I think we'll end the event there. I think if that's all right with everybody, I think it's I've thoroughly enjoyed hearing everyone speak. I'll make the recording available to everyone here. Before people go, I'd just like to say to check out Science Society, check out Krishna's on Facebook and everywhere, and stay tuned for CUSAP's next event, which will be this Friday, sorry. And yeah, I'd like to say thanks to everyone on the panel for a really engaging discussion.
Okay,
thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed yourself.
Yeah, it was fun.
Great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful, festive period, which is soon approaching. So thank you.
Thank you. Will do.
We're always it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.